You had the unique opportunity to write President Monson's biography, which I think fittingly is titled To the Rescue. Can you give us a brief idea of what went into that, taking this much life and turning it into not a slim volume, but a real condensation of an amazing life?
Writing President Monson's biography was exactly as you said. It was amassing all this information and then condensing it into something that gave the essence of who he was, but at the same time taught lessons and gave direction to people as they read it for their own lives. It wasn't about him per se, but it was all about him. You can see the difference in just recognizing that in order to do this, I read all the talks that he'd ever written down, that he'd ever given, and the stack was enormous. I read all of his journals he kept since the time he was called as an apostle, beginning in 1963. And at that time, there were 47 volumes. They were single-space typed. He dictated them every day. I read an enormous amount of correspondence that he called the special file, thinking it would be a little file. And it was filing cabinets full of letters and notes to him from people whose lives had been touched by his ministry. I had the opportunity to meet with him on a regular basis. And we would spend that time. We would spend hours talking about his life, not in terms of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but him relating his life like he did when he spoke in general conference. He would pull a story from his childhood and teach a principle, a doctrine, a truth around that story. I learned very quickly to identify that the way he saw his life was not in a measure of dates and experiences and events that he was a part of, but he saw his life in just a combination of stories that wove in and out of each other, and the people involved in them showed up time and time again in his life. And so it was all part of the whole, and so I tried to communicate the nature of the way he saw his life by telling his stories.
You titled your book, his biography, To the Rescue. And this may seem like a pretty obvious question, but why that title?
Well, there's a story behind that title. Let me tell you a story. I had been struggling to find a title for the book, and I had gone one direction, and I'd gone another direction. And there are threads through the book that when I read it, I can see what I was doing, thinking it might be this, it might be that, but none of them were working. And I sat down with President Monson one day and told him how discouraged I was about the whole process, that it wasn't coming together, and that I didn't know if I could do it. And I was far enough along that I had done it, but it wasn't, I didn't have a title, and I didn't have the pieces wrapped up. And he said to me, "Here's how I can help." He didn't say, "Well, good luck, I hope something happens, or go back and work harder, get up earlier, right. Yeah. You got to pray harder." He didn't say any of those things. He said, "Every morning when I get up, I'm going to kneel down by the side of my bed, and I'm going to pray that the Lord will be with you on your right hand and on your left." And suddenly I could feel all that burden that I'd been carrying lifted. And I went home that night, and I sat down with my husband, Jeff, and we went through the list of all the titles for the book that I thought were pretty dandy, and that might just be the title. And we went through the 2 pages, variations on theme, no. And we got all the way through them, and he looked at me and he goes, "I think we should read it again. I didn't see it, did you?" And I said, "No, it's not there." And then, "Let's read it again." Okay, so we started through it again. And I don't even remember what title he read, but into my mind came words that said the name of the book is To the Rescue. And I looked at my husband, I blurted out, the name of the book is To the Rescue. The Spirit just told me that. And so the next morning I went in and I sat down in President Monson's office and I said, I've got the name of the book. And he said, okay. And I said, it's To the Rescue. And he looked at me for a minute and he went, yeah, you're right. That is the name of the book. So it came by the power of inspiration. It came because I was ready to receive it, I guess. It came because that was the name of the book, and it wasn't on the list.
And what does it say about him?
The title depicts President Monson. That's who he was as a man all his life, reaching out to rescue people. That's who he was when he served in every quorum from the time he was in the Aaronic priesthood. That's who he was as a young bishop, rescuing people in a ward that so badly needed his help. That's who he was in the mission field, working with missionaries and members to catch the vision of the work of the Lord. That's who he was when he was called as an apostle of God. President McKay put it forward that by the power of inspiration, the Lord's work would be done. And that essentially is rescuing those who have stepped away from the church, rescuing those who have lost sight of their purpose, rescuing those who have yet to know, feel, understand, or make covenants with the Lord Jesus Christ, all for the purpose of bringing God's children home to him. That's the rescue mission. And his efforts to the rescue are simply a pattern for each one of us that we can be better. I remember giving a copy of the first few chapters of the book to one of my sons to read, and hoping that it made sense to someone who had not been immersed in this for 2 years of their life. And he came back sitting at the dining room table on Sunday afternoon, and he started to cry. And he looked at me and he said, Mom, I read these, and I can be better. I just know I can be better. And that's what To the Rescue is all about. We rescue ourselves, but we rescue those around us. And if everyone was doing that, think what a good place this world would be.